Okay, so we're going to continue to refine this, and that means going through and rebuilding some of this stuff and recreating it a little bit once I get the shapes on there that I know I'm going to like. Here I am fumbling with the topology brush. I've never been really good at this, and I'm still not. I usually just go into Z-spheres and just plot the points that way really quickly. But anyways, get the basic shapes that you want off of all these pieces. Oh, there you go. Yeah, I completely ditched topology brush and just rebuilt all the things with Z-spheres. And, you know, simple stuff like cylinders, you can just go and do an insert cylinder, and this is before Z-modeler, but obviously you could do a insert cylinder, Z-model it, bevel it, however you want, and just kind of rebuild your shapes and get nice clean stuff going on in there. I'm probably going to end up using some transpose stuff for that. And I guess that's kind of the give and the take as far as, do you concept sculpt something, you got a blobby mesh and you concept sculpt it and you put a whole ton of detail into this blob, and then if you need to break it apart, do you really break it apart in a real detailed way where you build in a bunch of stuff, or do you break it apart earlier and then some of your greebly stuff ends up just being passable on a higher res broken up mesh? You just got to kind of fill that out, I suppose. And I'm going to try the topology brush one more time. Like I mentioned before, if you use the move acu, so with the move brush go into curve and then turn on acu, you'll get those pointy, you can pull out to a point, to a corner. And it's not perfect for like a nice Z-modeled edge, but it's certainly good enough for getting your concepts pulled out to points and turning things into rectangles from circles, that kind of thing. And if you do have like a concept mesh that's sitting on or in something and you want to do a quick, it's going to be fitting into this piece, we'll just duplicate that concept mesh out, go ahead and do a subtractive Boolean from the original mesh, and then you'll already have your concept sitting inside where it needs to go. And this isn't really, I don't think, edited in any sort of way. I did this forever ago and recorded it forever ago, so I can't say that for sure, but I'm getting the feeling that you're just seeing a lot of exploration as well. You're not seeing the edited version where it's, here's me making all the right decisions and knowing exactly what I want to do and exactly how I'm going to do it. You're seeing a lot of, well, let's try this. Let's put this piece in there. Let's throw this around. Does that work? No. Oops. You just watched me work on something for 30 minutes and have to delete it. But I suppose there's value in that too. Because, I don't think I've ever sat down and made something exactly how I wanted to right out of the gate. and a lot of H-polish brush in there. And you're going to want to hold down Alt a lot. And also, so when you're doing H-polish, you want to make your brush size bigger than what you're working on, if that makes any sense. So if I'm brushing up like a thickness of that visor, I would make my brush slightly larger than that, and then just kind of feather touch the H-polish along that surface, just kind of run it along that surface, holding down Alt, and it'll actually pull very nicely up to that surface. If you have a really small H-polish brush and you're trying to polish a flat surface, you're going to get a lot of undulation and a lot of warbly kind of surface mesh details. So the bigger you make your H-polish brush, the broader the surfaces and the flatter the surfaces are going to be. And of course, that's only going to get you so far. If you do need big, broad surfaces that are really, really nice, probably rebuild it, crease it, subdivide it, that kind of thing. And there are some instances where you're concepting and you'll be like, oh, it would be so nice if I could just put an edge loop in here, extrude this face out of here. But you got to weigh, how fast is it to just, maybe you spend a little bit more time making a quick shape and doing a concept. But yeah, in a perfect world, it would be completely sub-D and rebuilt. But in my experience, me doing that usually means I'm not concepting as much, usually means I'm not making as good decisions on where things to go and where they need to be, because I'm spending so much time worrying about the topology and the specifics of edge flow and getting things to smooth correctly than I am actually getting things to be concepted out and thinking through ideas. And more than that, doing variations and kind of playing with it. And I'm very much more playful in ZBrush than I am when I'm over there massaging verts and extruding faces and creasing edges. And that might just be a me thing. You might sit down and you're very creative when you're in there, doing low poly to sub-D kind of stuff. But I find that I'm not. So waiting to do that kind of stuff until I have a pretty good idea of what I want is a little bit more beneficial for me. And of course, that face thing was just a mask extraction from the base face mesh. Decided to go ahead and close her face off, do something interesting. And the cool thing about helmets like this is you can always make it modular enough to where, you can slide something out, you can pop something off, and you can immediately get that face underneath there, and you can do variations like that, and it's totally cool. You saw how fast it was just to get those basic shapes down, and then I could go play with, well, what if I puff this side out? Well, it looks like she's got chubby cheeks. What if I sink it in? Oh, that's cool. It looks like a skull face. Or make it more angular or leaner or meaner or fatter or rounder or whatever the look you're going for. And that's stuff that I either wouldn't do or it would take me a lot longer to do that traditionally modeling. And even in ZBrush, the cool thing is I can add some greeble detail on there really quickly, and it doesn't have to be built in, but I can just sketch something on the surface really quick, and it'll indicate. It won't be actual detail. It'll be kind of like sketch detail. It'll be indication of stuff, but it'll still inform me as far as, is that too much? Is that detail too little? It doesn't have to be perfect, but just kind of has to inform when I go and make it perfect, or not perfect, but passable. Is that where I want my detail? At least I can answer those questions quickly, fast. That's the name of the game. Fail fast if you're going to bother. You're not going to get it right the first time. Then get in there and get it wrong real quick, and then start making judgment calls and evaluating. I've noticed the more I use the modeler and start with cubes and stuff and doing a lot more clipping, those tend to give me more mechanical angular, and again clipping from orthographic views as opposed to clipping just around an object and getting kind of these organic sculpty forms. They're both cool to do, but they end up giving you very different results. This is much more organic-y on the nose, and even the visor that started out very clippy and harsh and angular has been kind of softened down by the amount of use of trim dynamic and H-polish and move brush. It tends to just kind of soften your meshes up. So if you don't want it to do that, probably use a little more clip, use a little bit more insert brushes, and don't use the move brush to kind of, it tends to round out your forms. Maybe use a little more trim brush as opposed to trim dynamic, trim smooth border or something. And this bit here is reminiscent of, it's going to be reminiscent of the test Mech head where I put like a wire mesh over the little vent intakes. But then I decided I'll try out something a little crazier. Some mechanical tusks. Actually, looking at that, I don't know why I didn't keep those. Those are totally cool. And you saw how it went from curve to straight just using that move AcU. Just give it a corner as opposed to having it completely. And then of course if you want to soften that top edge transition, you can trim dynamic and then H-polish it down or smooth it down. Change the shape pretty dramatically. And this was a while ago, but I don't know that I've gotten a whole lot better at it, but doing convincing shapes based on actual CAD meshes or CAD data or things that are manufactured and, printed out or machined into parts and doing that kind of stuff. It's still these are pretty esoteric shapes, and you can always put greeble detail on esoteric shapes and turn them into something that looks, okay, I see how this was manufactured together. At this point, it's not real strong on this piece, obviously. But I will say, the more I use Fusion 360 and actually using a CAD program to make mechanical detail, you get a better feel for why things are modeled the way they are, because they have to be machined and they have to be manufactured in a way, and they have to be chamfered and filleted in a way that the machine can actually do, and that actually helps inform why you concept making those decisions, and always having reference obviously of machine parts, so that even if it is something from the crazy future, some machine has to actually make it, probably. So this adds a little bit of realism to your crazy concept shapes. And this technique of breaking it up and closing holes and refining the meshes, I still do. especially when I'm in the concept phase. If I'm not rebuilding for final, just trying to get new shapes in there. And it's messy and it requires a little bit of cleanup, but it's faster than some alternatives. And that's just a slice brush, and you hit Alt once to get the Bezier curve. You can use spacebar to move it around, then Alt twice to give the sharp curve. That'll slice it into a different polygroup. Then you can hide point split hidden, or you can group split, and then you can close holes and pull that back, or you could do an extract to get skin thickness, or you could do Z remesh to get a nicer mesh. And actually that's something, now that I think about it, I probably would do now more often, is if I break something up and it's just a single-sided mesh, go ahead and hit Z remesh, and it'll give you a nicer mesh that you can then go into Z modeler and do a Q mesh to kind of give it thickness, or a panels under your edge loops, geometry edge loops, or an extract and give you nicer thickness because it's a nicer Z remesh than what I'm doing here. So keep that in mind. And I always want topology brush to be, I want to be faster at it than I ever actually am. This might have actually been before my custom menu. So what I ended up doing was just making a custom menu that I assigned to one of my hotkeys. So I had really easy access to, really quick access to all my Z-sphere topology stuff. So that's pretty much what I use now, because it's very easy for me just to throw something in a Z-sphere in there, quickly go hit Alt-A to go to my marking menu, which has all my Z-sphere stuff and everything else too. But I've got a little Z-sphere section, so I can do really quickly edit topology, make adaptive skin, delete topology, make, all that stuff that I need access to, as opposed to scrolling up and down the tool menu. And so it makes me much more likely to actually just use Z-spheres as opposed to the topology brush. Seems to get things done a little bit faster. And it seems with the topology brush I end up putting a lot of extraneous edge loops in there. Like you can see, if I would have used these spheres, I would have had a lot fewer polygons in here, which would be easier to smooth and crease and a lot less work. So I'm actually fighting against the topology here to get something nice and smooth, as opposed to just going simpler. So now I'm actually having to clip back all these faces, as opposed to just building simple faces that go from one end to the other without any interval faces. But oh well, I tried it, didn't quite work. And putting a rubber gasket around something, it's easy enough just to draw a curve spline, but it does require a little bit of pushing and prodding and pulling. You could also do the whole make a surf, have a surf, a pre-existing surface, cut something out or mask something out with a polygroup, Control W, for deformation, polish by features with an open circle to kind of get a nice smooth curve, and then do a border, frame border with a curve under the curve options, and then do a curve insert brush and kind of get a nice tube around that shape that you want, as opposed to dragging out a tube and kind of wrangling it into place around shapes. But I didn't have a shape really right there where I wanted it, so I kind of had to wrangle it. Although it might actually be easier in that case to maybe use the topology brush to kind of do a topology line around those weird shapes and then do another one around it and then just kind of divide it up using topology and then giving it a little bit of thickness, and then you have a tube automatically. So, I don't know. And if topology brush is giving you problems, remember you can make your brush size bigger to get less topology lines. Might make it a little bit easier. And just rebuilding the simple shapes, which of course using ZModeler would be a lot easier to do. But doing it the old-fashioned way here. So get rid of my kludgy concept mesh, and then here's a little Boolean mesh. And again, like I said, at this point, it would, looking at this now, this would just be a Z-modeled dynamic sub D thing, but at the time, it was just easier to build the shapes like that with a primitive and then another primitive and then Boolean together with Dynamesh and call it a day. And on that face fires you saw, I was going back and forth on whether to make it a Dynamesh or keep it low poly, because I know as soon as I make it a Dynamesh, I can start doing more cooler stuff and cutting stuff in and adding stuff and pulling stuff around, and doing that quickly. But I'll lose the nice low-res stuff if I want to make changes and bevels and stuff to the low-res cage. So just kind of going back and forth with that. And those little those little bars that I drug out, just to give it like a little finger clip thing, was I think a E3D Mike Jensen thing. I think that it's just basically a rectangle with drag dot or drag rect, and you can just drag that rectangle on the edge of a line that you've carved in, and it'll give it look like it has a little. You do inverted on one side and puffed out on the other side, Z-add. So Z sub Z-add on one side or the other, and it'll make it look like it has a little indentation for your thumb to go underneath, and then a little ridge to kind of grab onto. So it looks like you can kind of pop a plate off next to each other. And occasionally when you're doing detail stuff like this and you're being picky and kind of just barely touching, and sometimes it behooves you to just kind of take a step back and take the move brush with a big brush size and just kind of pull things around with a snake hook brush and see if that gives you anything interesting. Usually it does, actually. And while you're at this super low sketch phase, even though you're kind of getting noodly with it, it doesn't really ruin anything or waste any of your time to kind of go and explore a little bit outside the box. In this case right here, what I would do is I would mask and make a poly group, and then you can inset those. What I did was mask, make a poly group with those isolated, do the polish by features, which you can see kind of rounds out those edges. So what I would do now is kind of the Tom Paul method of groups loops. So you would make all these shapes cut in, and then go ahead and mask. So you've masked it, and then you're going to make a poly group out of these. And then what I would do is go over to groups loops and turn polish all the way down to 0. And then that'll give you an inner group that you can just, push those back and get really nice topology, and it'll keep your corners nice and sharp. You see I kind of had warbly lines there because I wanted sharp corners, but Polish by Features was going to round my corners, so it wasn't ideal. But use groups loops with no polish, and that'll get you around that hurdle. And this is kind of emulating like what in Fusion 360 would be just webbing, you know, reinforced kind of webbing girder structures inside of objects to kind of keep it light, but also give it a little bit of strength inside. And see something like that is like, oh, spent quite a lot of time just to kind of push that shape in, so I hope it was worth it. And all, you know, all these different ports that you can put on there, and then you know what I'd probably do is put the tubes on there if I'm going to end up having a bunch of tubes, is go ahead and put those on, and then that'll dictate where the ports go, as opposed to putting a bunch of ports on there and then having the tubes be dictated by that, just because the tubes are going to end up making a bigger impact on the overall design than where your little ports are. Those can go anywhere, so I don't know, maybe do your tubes first and then decide where your ports need to go. And this is a good use of Shadowbox. So for any kind of complicated gear stuff that would be kind of a pain, I mean, it wouldn't be that big of a pain to model, but it's certainly fast to do it this way. Just get a really nice refined model, and even if it's a little bit soft, you can always go back in with your clip and just kind of make it a little bit, or do a Boolean to kind of get the high-res detail you're looking at. And like I keep saying, a lot of this stuff now would just be done with ZModeler. Cylinder, add an edge loop, Q-mesh it back, get a nice bevel, all that good stuff. And if I would have thought about it, I probably would have done it back then too, with just transpose modeling, but, you know, oh well. like we're getting near the end of this video. This is just more of the same, you know, cutting it with a standard brush, or Damien standard if that's your poison. Turn on lazy mouse if you need clean cuts, cleaner lines, and then eventually if you do need to actually divide this mesh up, you can decide at that point, is lazy mouse with a standard brush good enough? You can bake from that and get the detail you want, and you know, your maps will dictate if dirt falls in there, or catch an edge for edge wear and all that good stuff. It'll show up, I promise. And also the resolution you're going to be baking at. Does it really, really need to be cut in? Yes, no, maybe. Who knows? And usually the answer is, oh, of course you want to build it in. It's going to make a huge difference, and it's going to be so much cleaner. But then when you bake it out onto your 1024 and it gets in game and you're running around, it's got dirt on it with materials and lighting, nobody cares. So pick and choose your battle. You know, you spend a lot of time rebuilding something, or you bake something off and get it in and evaluate it and go, hey, you know what? I don't need to spend a lot of time. Now, ideally, you would have an asset library to pull from that would have all resurface super nice stuff that you can go and do IMAX renders for your portfolio. But rarely is that the actual case. And here, you know, pulling in a bunch of details from the ZBrush library and just kind of adding some detail that way is super fun. And not building everything from scratch. And since then, I've actually done an insert brush cylinder that I'm looking at straight on, so I can draw it right on the center of the mesh, and it's the back of the cylinder looking at me as opposed to the front face. And that's very useful for doing right down the middle cylinders as opposed to kind of fighting it like I did there. So, 4 more minutes. Actually, less than that. Yeah, and at this point I'm just kind of looking for stuff to kind of steal from the ZBrush insert library. Tons of stuff in there. That's, you go BI for brush insert, and as well go to the ZBrush Central, Z-Central forums, and there's an insert mesh thread that just has a ton that you can pull from. And stuff like that where I'm trying to get a really specific shape, like, you know, I kind of want it rounded up and then a divot in the middle. If you end up doing that a lot, just make a custom brush. Go grab a plane, make your document size 1024 by 1024 or whatever, scale, zoom out so you can see it, frame that plane, and then just kind of build that exact screw port you're looking for, capture the alpha, turn it into a brush, and just use that over and over again. Put it into your brush library. And at this point, you know, I'm just going crazy on the helmet, and I've been neglecting the entire rest of the body, obviously, but, you know, just for fun. Add some tubes, add some screws. And of course, you can change that on the fly if you don't like it. As long as it's still in curve mode, you can go grab another curve brush and tap it, and it'll just update on the fly.